This video is sponsored by Coursera. A few weeks ago, I released this video about how I recently went through an entire proofs textbook on my own, which is something I had never done before. And you guys seem to like it, but I also got a lot of follow-up questions about more advice I would give. So I wanted to make this video to talk about some of the things I think I did well and other things I could have done differently. Now, like I said in that video, it took me about 4 months to get through the entire textbook, which consisted of at least 30 minutes a day of working through it, whether it be reading, doing practice problems, or whatever. So the first thing that I seriously never did while I was in school, but I did a lot while going through this textbook, was look ahead at future chapters so I could see exactly what was coming. This really helped me see the big picture of where I was headed with this textbook, so it was easier to kind of connect the dots as I worked through it. So when I came across new vocab words, I would often look ahead to see where they came up again in future chapters. And I would never start working through a section before I skimmed through all of it to kind of see what the key material was. Really, I was just trying to build chunks of this puzzle that is the subject at hand so that I could see the big picture, even if I couldn't solve every little thing quite yet. This is actually a screenshot from Coursera's course on learning how to learn, and this part is something I definitely agreed with.
Learn the major concepts or points first. These are often the key parts of a good instructor or book chapter's outline, flowcharts, tables, or concept maps. Once you have this done, fill in the details.
I actually think a lot of schools are very bad at this, at least that's how it was in my experience, because a lot of the engineering courses I took just started off with technical information, whether it be equations, formulas, engineering vocab words, and so on. But there was really no context about where this was headed or why we were learning it. I actually still have my textbook from the electromagnetism courses I had to take, and I remember on the first day I was so confused. Yeah, I remember my teacher immediately gave us this circuit that I had never seen before. Then she shows us the more official representation and proceeds to go through a derivation of key equations. That's literally how it started. There was no introduction, no context, no foreplay, nothing, just right into it. Honestly, that first day to me sounded like,
whereas shalagadoola mechakaboola equals X and bibbidi bobbidi boo is Y. Put them together and what have you got? Bibbidi bobbidi boo, X plus Y equals Y, X equals 0. The song is badly written.
Yeah, that pretty much sums it up. But that's often how classes went for me, where we didn't really get the big picture of what's to come. So I should have done that research on my own, as I recommend you guys should whenever entering a new class. So the moral of the story is looking ahead at future sections and just getting an idea of what's to come is a really powerful learning strategy. Next up, another classic example of what everyone tells you is don't cram, because it takes time to learn something new, which we all know is totally not true, because we've all crammed before and done totally fine on various tests. But let me ask you this. That test you crammed for like 2 years ago, how much of that information do you still remember? Or how well could you do if you had to take that test again? Yeah, the answer is probably not very well, unless of course you've seen that material since then. So when people say don't cram, it's because you'll never gain a deep understanding of any subject by trying to learn it all at once. And I think the fact that I didn't have any tests or exams while going through this made it easier to not cram actually. I never gave myself goals or deadlines or anything like that, which maybe I should have done, but I feel like that would have rushed me. I always took as long as I needed to learn something well, and then I could move on from there. And I feel like that really helped. I'm not saying you should learn too slowly, because if I had more time, I would have definitely used it. But the fact that I could never cram in an entire section in one day probably did help a little bit. Now, I think one thing we could all relate to is being overwhelmed by all the material in a course, especially when it comes to a midterm or a final. Since I'm not in school, I didn't have to deal with those, but looking at the sheer amount of material definitely was overwhelming at times, especially combined with how slow the progress was. But the one thing I had to keep telling myself was any progress was good progress. If I read one page in an hour and understood it decently, that was progress. If I did part A of one problem, then that was good. Even if it was wrong, I would almost always have spent at least 30 minutes trying to figure it out, and with just that, I would usually learn something. I remember I was watching an online math lecture a while back, and this one line really stuck with me.
Most of the time, you won't feel as though you're making any progress. Your goal has to be understanding, not doing.
Now, he goes on to say you still have to do practice problems, but overall it's the learning that should be the goal, not just getting the right answer, even though that is good to do too. You can think of this as process over product, which you can't say when designing a plane. Like, I don't care how you do it, but you better get me to my destination alive. But when it comes to learning, it's more important that you learn the material rather than just get the right answer and move on. So when working through questions, I would always tell myself, even if I was completely wrong, that so long as I had put real effort into it, maybe learned something new along the way, maybe recalled something from an earlier chapter and applied it well, then that was progress. I know it's different for the people that are in school, but overall, if you're overwhelmed by something, just at least take it one topic at a time. Because as soon as you teach yourself one thing, it just gets easier from there. One piece of advice I took away from a video I made a long time ago was recalling material is more beneficial than rereading it. To know whether you understand something, you should try to recall it yourself, whether it be reciting a vocabulary definition or doing the math problem on your own. Just looking over it again will make you think you know it when in fact you might not. Honestly, it was crazy just how often I would go to replicate a proof I was just reading over, only to find out I didn't even remember what the first step was. Or maybe I didn't remember how to go from step 2 to step 3, and so on. So before I would ever tell myself I understood something, I would make sure I could do it on my own. Now, one thing I did not do well relates to the two modes of thinking, which are focus mode and diffuse mode. Focus mode is of course where you're focused on something with no distractions, whereas diffuse mode, which is just as important, is where you take a break from the learning and just let your mind make connections in the background. And that way you come back to the content with a fresh mind. And I know this sounds odd, but it's very true. Just think about when you leave an exam and figure out the solution to that one problem within a minute of walking out the door. Even top mathematicians have made discoveries when they were doing just some leisure activity, not when they were focusing on finding an answer. I kind of combined these two modes of learning, which wasn't great, as I would often work like with the TV on or with YouTube up in front of me, and I would start doing a problem but might become distracted after 5 minutes, and I wouldn't get into a real focus mode of learning. I mean, sometimes I did, but other times I didn't. To really learn something on a deep level, it's best to focus on that task for some amount of time, whether it be 30 minutes or an hour, and then take a break after that. Another thing I kind of did well, but also kind of didn't, is spaced repetition. Check out this one part from the Learning How to Learn course.
When you encounter something new, you often use your working memory to handle it. If you want to move that information into your long-term memory, it often takes time and practice. To help with this process, use a technique called spaced repetition. This technique involves repeating what you're trying to retain, but what you want to do is space this repetition out, repeating a new vocabulary word or a problem-solving technique, for example, over a number of days.
Why I'm saying I did this kind of well is because, again, any section would take me over a week to complete, and sometimes one problem would take me 2 or 3 days. So it would force me to, well, do all those problems over several days. But I also didn't do this well because while going through this book, all I wanted to do was learn the information well and then move on. I never really went back and looked over old material like you have to when dealing with exams and finals and all of that. Because of this, I did notice that trying to recall material from earlier chapters sometimes was harder when I hadn't seen it since. Then another thing I did not do well was interleaving. Now, when most of us do our homework, we do it from one section, and then the following day or week or whatever, we do it from the next section as assigned by our teacher, which is exactly what I did. But in order to help your brain think more independently and allow for more creativity, it can be more beneficial to mix up the problems that you do. Like before your next final, try to do some problems from chapter 5, and then chapter 3, then chapter 7, and so on. Because when you're on the integration by parts section of your calculus textbook and you know that, it's obvious what the approach will be. You're in integration by parts mode. But if you mix it up and pull random problems on varying topics like a final exam is built to do, it will allow you to think more independently and bring together the various subjects you were taught in that course. It would have been smart of me when I was on like chapter 5 to just flip back to maybe chapter 3 and attempt one of the problems. Even if I did that like once a week, it would have been beneficial, but I just didn't. I honestly did not know whether I'd be able to make it through the entire textbook because this is actually something I've tried before and failed at after I reached a certain point where it just felt like I couldn't move on without getting help from someone. But for one, that's why we have the internet, which I used a lot when going through this textbook. And two, there are ways to get better at learning, ways to make the process of learning a new subject or going through a new course easier. And the Coursera course I was going through, which is one of their most popular, again called Learning How to Learn, has several more techniques and strategies for getting over classic problems that students have, whether it be procrastination, test taking, improving memory, or just becoming a better learner. The lectures give you tangible ways to improve your learning and tips to get over bad habits that may be holding you back from a higher GPA or just developing a better understanding of a complex subject. So whether you need to improve your grades, or you're thinking about going back to school and need to relearn old subjects, or you just want to learn something new, then I definitely recommend this course, which is linked below. Or if you just want to jump into real technical subjects, Coursera partners with industry leaders from Stanford and Yale to Google or IBM to bring you courses I know many people in this audience would find interesting, including machine learning and data science to robotics and power electronics. Again, links are below, and with that, I'm going to end that video there. If you guys enjoyed, be sure to like and subscribe. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter and join the Made For It Facebook group for updates on everything. Hit that bell if you're not being notified, and I'll see you all in the next video.